Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Sharon Cavallaro, and I work for the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project, also known as SPP-TAP. We work within the Napa County Office of Education under contract with California Department of Education. And our responsibility is to assist districts identified as disproportionate or significantly disproportionate in their efforts toward equity. We are really glad to have a large participant group today because Dr. Dome's work is very important to us at SPP-TAP. Please use the chat box to identify yourself. Tell what your district you're from and any colleagues who may be with you. We maintain several resources that are at no cost or low cost to local education agencies. These include ongoing assistance from SPP-TAP staff members, individual technical assistance, webinars, and virtual community of practice meetings. In addition, we maintain a great deal of current academic and practical information on our website, SPPTAP.org. We do want to hear from you throughout this webinar, so please feel free to use the chat box throughout our time together.
Mute off. You have been muted. To unmute yourself, press the star key twice.
As we like to make our webinars available after they are complete, we record them so they become part of our project's learning library. Dr. Nancy Dome is well regarded in her work to help schools and school districts integrate cultural competence into their organizations. She is the founder and CEO of Epoch Education, and she's an authority in creating equitable schools. We are grateful to have her with us today. Please welcome Dr. Nancy Dome.
Introduction, and thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Sharon, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today and looking forward to being able to engage to the best of our ability through the chat box. I will be going through my slides, and I ask that if you have questions to go ahead and type them in, and hopefully we'll be able to get a little bit of dialogue going that way. We also have a couple activities planned where we're going to ask you to reflect on some of the things that we're talking about. So with that, I'm just going to get started. And again, I'm Nancy Dome, founder of Epoch Education. And when I was approached to do this webinar, we were really thinking, I was thinking about kind of where my work has been going over the last couple of years, and this notion of equity and trying to help people get their heads around it. And one of the things that I continually discover as I work with districts is that that equity still appears to be this add-on, this thing that we do, and then we're done. And I really want to encourage, and that's what inspired this webinar topic, is this notion that of equity by design. That if we want to actually have equitable practices within our systems, that we actually have to design our systems to support them. So they have to be an integral part of what we do. And so that takes us to this idea of this law of intentionality, that we have to be intentional with our actions, intentional with our design, intentional with understanding our outcomes in order for equity to truly be embedded in everything that we do, not just a piece of what we do. And growth doesn't just happen. We really have to put effort into it. I'll say this all throughout, but when we talk about the work of equity, it's not a destination. You're not done. It's a journey. It's something that we're constantly striving for and evaluating and revising and modifying so that we can actually see the fruition of our efforts, and that it's going to change. And so we're going to have to keep adapting to the changes that are happening in our institutions and in our society. So just to get a common definition that we can all work with together today, I'd like to just put out that the definition we're using today is that equity is the fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all people. This notion of everyone being included. And when we talk about using an equity lens, which is what I'm going to refer to throughout the session, it's this idea that everything we do, it's almost like the glasses I have on. If these are my glasses, then this is equity. And so everything that I'm looking through has the influence of this lens that I'm looking at. So we talk about our policies, our outcomes, you know, power structures, relationships, solutions, the list goes on, but everything that we're addressing in our systems should be put through this lens of equity. I got to get my button to work. There we go. So this requires that we, when we put this equity lens on, that we're actually striving to eliminate barriers that prevent us from the full participation of some groups. And so that means that we have to first even be willing to look at who are those groups that are marginalized. And the thing that's kind of ironic is that we actually know, like we can racially predict who will be over disciplined, who will be overrepresented in special education, and yet we haven't quite figured out how to address those disparities. And so it's not only in the identifying, but in really being committed to eliminating the barriers that exist, which means that we may have to start looking very closely at our systems differently than we have. We've put the responsibility on externally from us. A lot of the responsibility is put on our students and their behaviors and parents and families, and yet the things that we have control over are the things that we actually need to be looking at, which is who am I and how do I show up, and how does who I am and how I show up impact my interactions with my students and with the families and with the community. We also need to see, when we talk about equity, is this notion of equitable distribution of resources. And again, there's going to be a video that we'll look at, and we won't see it, but there's information that we show that you have schools that have loads of access, loads of resources, and then you have schools that have nothing, that the playgrounds are dirt and concrete, and you know, our kids are not having the same access, so they're not having the same experience. And so when are we going to start looking at it from a more kind of systemic approach? And then finally, it's really imperative that we begin to understand the root cause of the inequity at each institution. And so in order to do that, I'll walk us through some steps that will help us start to look at that. You've all seen this before, although this is a newer version, so I wanted to share it again because I love the evolution of this graphic. But basically, we know that equality, which is what we've all kind of, when we were in our teaching training, you know, we were talking about equality, you know, everyone getting the same thing. And in education, that's actually problematic, and I think most of us already understand that and know that on this call. And so we've been really striving for this idea of equity. And as this graph or image demonstrates, equity is basically people getting what they need so that we can have equal access, right? So the little guy gets 2 boxes, right? But ideally, I mean, when we get to the ideal world, we'd like to remove all barriers, right? So there's no wall in the first place, that everyone can just be who they are and be able to access, and because all the supports are already embedded in what's happening. So I like this. I know that it can be easily found, and I encourage us to start using this because our goal is really getting to here where there's no longer any barriers. All right, so how do we start this work? And the first thing that we have to do is actually do a root cause analysis. And I know that that's kind of a phrase that's been coming up a lot, but it's super, super important. we have to use the data. Schools collect all kinds of data, and whether or not they actually gets down to the practitioner is actually pretty rare. And even at the leadership level, how are we using the data that we get? Are we just using it when we're having to apply for grants, or are we just using it, when something comes up? But how do we make this the way we do business, where we're looking at our data queries on a monthly basis to see where are we falling short, where are we making progress, and what's happening so that's impacting these numbers changing. In this image here, and why I like this image specifically, it's this notion of actual school staff, not just teachers, but all your staff engaging with your data and being able to make sense of it, so that they can so that we can empower them to be leaders around using this information. And it should be available to everyone. We have to start thinking of data as a coaching mechanism, and not so much of just, not just telling the outcomes, but really an opportunity for us to grow, use it, and coach. All right. So here's an example of some data. This comes from CBEDS from 2016-2017 school year. When we look at the ethnic distribution for teachers in California, 63.3% are white. And the rest, and that's actually an improvement. The last CBEDS data that I used, it was around 71%. So we're actually doing a better job of trying to bring in people of color into our schools. And so what we have to do is, one, understand that because we're 63% white teachers in California, that we really need to make sure that our teachers understand the importance of being culturally competent. And understanding that also, as white teachers, you're also bringing in white culture, and what is that culture and how does it show up? And a lot of times, because we have been so conditioned not to talk about race, we actually, when the question comes up, what is my culture, we actually don't know, or we become very uncomfortable with it. And so we have to start investigating. It becomes important because of this, because when you look at the student demographics for California, we are at 27%, 26 point, whatever percent, 23% white teachers, which means 77% of our students are students of color, okay, with 54 being a very large population of Latino, Hispanic students. So when you have this kind of disconnect between who we're serving and who's doing the serving, we really then begin to understand why it's imperative that we are culturally competent, that we understand that our kids are coming in with different experiences, different backgrounds, based on socioeconomics, based on ethnicity, demographics, and then maybe even we're coming in with. And so we have to know that it's our responsibility to get to know who our kids are, get to know who our families are. And it's not so much this idea that I think we've approached education for a very long time of more, they need to know who I am, they need to know who our schools are. I think the responsibility is for us to step out and not so much try to assimilate, but to actually respect the cultures that folks are bringing, and to make a space for them so that we can all be together and thrive together as who we are. So that goes back to that image of no barriers. So who do you say you are? When we start looking at the data and we start looking at things like our mission statements and things like that, and what does the data tell you who you are? And those sometimes do not go together. Who we say we are, we put them in our missions, our visions, our values, and they're usually very inspiring and uplifting, and they need to be. But they also need to be clear enough so that when we start rolling out programming and doing things, that we can always put it up to our mission and say, is this in alignment with who we say we are? Now, we can say we're one thing, but the data will always tell us truly who we are. So when you, one of the practices that you can do right away is just to go back to your site and actually engage with your mission, vision and values in a way that, and then engage with your data and say, does the data reinforce who we say we are? And that's super, super important. Also that we begin to review policies and procedures, again, matching it up. The data says this, how do our policies and procedures either support or not support what we're saying who we are in a way that allows us to meet the needs of all of our kids. And so some of the things that we should be looking at when we look at data should be your student enrollment and your staff demographics. Who are they? So we saw California, but you can get very personal to see what's happening at a very site or district level or county office level. But we should be, at the very least, looking at our discipline referrals, suspensions and expulsions, looking at who has access to rigor, so GATE and AP if you're lower elementary and middle school, AP honors, GATE and honors, and then AP and honors for high school. Who's in those classes? And that should always be matched up against what your demographics are. So are you in proportion? Are you disproportionate? You know, and again, who do you say you are? What does your data tell you you're doing? And then finally, we should be looking at the very least at graduation rates, dropout, and now with A through G elections, who's opting out of A through G? Are they opting out on their own? Are they being pushed out? You know, these are the tough questions that we actually really have to start having. How do decisions get made at your site? So this is two. If you are really using equity as a lens, the idea is that you need to have a cohesive and inclusive team. So my question is always, whose voice is in the room? Do you have adequate representation of who your community is? So if you're sitting in a room making decisions, who's missing? And putting the equity lens on means we're asking that question. So you can do your work, but at the end of the day, if you know that there's some key voices that are missing in that space as you make these decisions, how do you get them in there? And when you use equity as a lens, this is something that you just do. Like you recognize that there is a lack, there is something missing, and that you go strive for it. So when we start thinking about policy changes and procedural changes, and then just decisions that impact the entire system, we need to be cognizant that that there may be voices missing and asking those hard questions. How effective is your communication? So number 3, we have a protocol that's called compassionate dialogue that really calls for us to be direct, open, and honest with each other, and it allows us to have these difficult conversations, but to have them with compassion. A lot of times, the communication at sites, there's not a lot of transparency. There's personality conflicts, and so how do we begin to really increase our own expectations of how we are communicating with each other? So the first piece of the protocol is recognize it, and when we recognize it, it's first just even identifying what the problem is, or what the offense is. The example would be maybe of 2 kids fighting. So we recognize that's a problem. That's not even an issue. And so we move into step number 2, which is interrupt it really quickly because we know we have something to do. Well, let's say that instead of something that's so obvious as a fight, it's more like someone says something that kind of triggers you, that hits you a little differently. And you know that it didn't sit right with you. You also have to recognize that, because usually what happens is that something will trigger us. It could be a microaggression, it could be just an aggression, but we're not really sure how to respond. And so if we stop and recognize it, and we get in touch with how we feel about it, so feeling words like that hurt my feelings, or I'm shocked, or that, whatever those words are, that allows us to know that we need to step into the next step. And so the first step is recognize it, and we're going to have an opportunity to practice. The second step is interrupt it. So once I've recognized that I've been triggered by something, and again, this could be on a personal level, interpersonal level, organizational level, once I recognize I've been triggered or something's not working, what am I going to do to interrupt it? And so when you interrupt it, especially if it's interpersonal, we want to start with questions. That questions help us kind of make sure that, one, we understand what we've heard and that we're not misinterpreting something, but it also helps us stop what's happening in its tracks instead of waiting for later. So interrupt it could be, tell me more. It could be, this is what I heard, can you explain this? Or, you know, anything that allows us to stop what's happening and to engage in a conversation that doesn't shut down the dialogue. And that's super, super important. Because when you shut down the dialogue, then you can't move forward, and this stays in the air. And then the third piece of the protocol is repair it. And this is a piece that typically doesn't get done. I always say that the only time repair it happens consistently is usually when you're living with a person, whether it's your spouse or your children or your roommate, because you can only avoid each other for so long in your home. So, but when you're in the office or in your whatever space you're in, the repair it just becomes something that kind of falls off. So repair it calls us to either come back later that day, the next day, a week later, and to check in and to rebuild and heal whatever might have been broken in the interrupted. And it also begins to model for us that we can actually be in disagreement with each other, and it's okay. Like it's actually healthy. It begins to reinforce what healthy, effective communication looks like. It doesn't mean that we always agree with each other. It means that we are able to communicate and share what we're feeling and hear the other person and come to whether it's a consensus, a compromise, or even an agreement to disagree, but that it becomes normalized that we are having these difficult conversations. So we're going to practice interrupting negative remarks, and this is what I would put on an interpersonal kind of frame. The first one, and I'll walk us through this, and then I'll give you the other ones, is that's gay. And what you'll see is right now on the side, you've got a chat box, a separate chat box from the main one that has just popped up, and it says recognize it. And so what I want you to do is I want you just to write down what your feeling is when you hear that. So we want to get to feeling words. It can be anger, frustration, or a question mark, which means I don't have a problem with it. But only feeling words. Don't try to fix it. Just take your time. Go ahead. Okay, so we've got someone who says offended, that's mad. Yes. Okay, so we're right on there. We'll give it another little bit. I feel uncomfortable. It's rude. So rude, I'm going to push back a little bit and just say rude is not a feeling. Rude is a response to a it's still external from you. So I'm going to ask that if you're not talking about a feeling inside of you, that you think about and take it another level deeper to get to a feeling. So childish, again, childish is a response. You're talking about somebody else externally. I'm going to invite us to bring it to ourselves. So I can think something is childish, but how do I feel about it? So I can be angry about that, or I can, yeah, we're getting there, hurtful, upset, sad, great. And so, and the reason I focus on feelings here is because I think that we've also been kind of, I also feel like we have been kind of conditioned as educators to not really take into account what triggers us. But we have to really be clear that if something makes you angry, your response, your interruption is going to be far different than if something makes you sad. So if I use this as an example of a student maybe in your class who says something and it triggers anger, his or her consequence may be far more severe if you're not aware that it triggers anger in you. Because if it triggers sadness, your response might be different. It might be more of a conversation. It might be more of an explanation. But when you're angry, it's different. So by us simply getting in touch with how we feel about it, it allows us to, as my friend says for me, ride my emotional waves. I get to ride my waves, and then I get to address objectively with what's happened instead of that subjective kind of response that's all based and tied into how I feel about it. So that's the main reason why we have to understand why feelings for us are so important. Okay, so the second piece of the protocol, or let me show you the rest actually. So the other ones that we get to address are, here we go. You are good at giving directions for a woman. I bet 80% of my kids will end up pregnant or in jail before they finish high school. And what are they cooking and eating over there? The smell is atrocious. Can't she just have a sandwich like everyone else? So what I'm going to ask you to do now, and these are all scenarios that were submitted for our card decks called Conversation Starters, and they were submitted by people who actually experienced these. So we did not make them up. And the reason they were submitted is because these were comments that were made that they wished they would have been able to interrupt. And they didn't know how to. And so the whole idea of Conversation Starters is that we actually get to practice. Because what we know with anything is that the more we practice, the more effective we are at it. If you're an athlete, if you play an instrument, you know that practicing is crucial to mastery. So just like that, these conversations, we need practice because most of the time the reason we avoid them is because we're not comfortable because we haven't practiced them, so we get to practice. So again, I'm going to have you look at all four of these. Pick one. We've all kind of responded to the first one, that's gay, but I'd like us to maybe look at one of the other three and just share the feelings again. So again, getting in touch. What are the feelings that come up for you as you focus on one of these cards? Shocked, anger, indifferent, angry, furious, yeah. And so what's interesting is that, you know, if we're indifferent to it, how does that impact our ability to interrupt? And that's really important because if I'm indifferent or if I don't actually see it as an issue, then what that does is it means that I basically am done with the protocol. Because if I don't have an issue with it, there's nothing that's going to inspire me to interrupt. And that's okay. It's just good to understand because just say that the person who's indifferent and I are in the same space together. And there's a comment that said that I have a distinct reaction to that makes me angry. And then the other person's indifferent. What can also happen is that me and this person are now in a misunderstanding because I don't understand why you don't see this as a problem and you don't understand why I do. And so that's also a conversation to be had because sometimes we feel like we've been abandoned by our colleagues because they didn't stand up for us or, you know, or share anything, but it also could be that they didn't actually take it, they didn't have a problem with what was said. And that's really the beauty of being individuals with so many perspectives, but that's also why we need many voices in the room. Because there's some people, for me, mine is always, you're so articulate. And there's some people who will not have a problem with that at all, who actually thinks that when I'm told that it's a compliment. Except for me, it comes from a deficit model thinking, so it offends me when someone tells me how articulate I am. And so this is where we begin to talk and understand that not everyone sees things the same way, which is why we have to have all voices in the room, okay? So great, we've done a great job with our feelings. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to the second part, which is interrupted. So you'll notice that the chat box disappeared and there's a new one that says interrupted. So when you interrupt it, again, I want to focus us on if, based on what your feelings were, how would you interrupt it that would actually lead to further discourse? not just shut it down, because our goal is not to shut down the conversation. Our goal is to engage in compassionate dialogue. So maybe you could now just touch in with your feelings, and then what would you say to that person who said one of these 4 scenarios? What would you say to interrupt them that would be questioning or sharing how it made you feel? Yes, so Elizabeth has said, say more. That's effective, that will work. What other things might you say? I do not believe that you really think your students will not succeed. So I'm going to go back to Sharon while the other ones come in there. The minute you say, I do not believe to someone, I think that you begin to put them on defense because it's now kind of an accusation going back at them. And so how might we restate that so that it becomes more of a question that they have to explain rather than a statement about what they've said or done? So women can't give good directions. Why is that? Yeah. Yeah. And even that could be structured. And again, I'm not, and what I'm talking about is not about being politically correct. And I want to be clear that we're not going to get these confused. I'm not trying to let the person off the hook. What I'm trying to do is actually hold them accountable. And the way I hold them accountable is by having them explain to me instead of me telling them what I think, having them explain what they mean. Hopefully through this process, we also get them thinking that, wow, there might have been something problematic about what I just said. Yeah. I wonder what the statistics are for students graduating. Yeah, we could go there. We could go right to data again. But I think the thing about going straight to data is we're not really still holding them quite accountable. So I would maybe ask more of a question like, what do you why would you say that? Why would that be your belief? What experiences do you have that make you think that? Again, because what's problematic is not so much, and I'm going to go back to that one just so we can see it, what's problematic about this statement has more to do with the lack of expectations that they have for the kids. And the fact that they think they end up correct. So we've got stereotypes, we've got implicit bias, there's a whole lot playing up in this card. So when we go to data, we actually in some ways validate that they may be right? And so that's not what we want to do. What we want to do is push against the bias that's in the statement. So how could we push against this bias? And that would be getting them to talk more about the bias and not trying to validate or invalidate their statement based on data. So this would be the one example where I would say data is not necessarily what we're trying to get at. What we're trying to get at is their belief system about who these kids are and what their potential is. Yeah, I like that. Suwinder, that's too bad. I love the smell and taste of the food. Exactly. I'm a fan of sarcasm myself, and I say that with a smile because it's not necessarily effective in compassionate dialogue, but it's very effective in interrupting. And so if we choose to interrupt with sarcasm, which is again kind of my tendency sometimes, then we have to know that our repair is going to be harder. And so, but sometimes humor does work in actually kind of shifting the feelings so that you can actually have a dialogue as opposed to everyone being really tense and in fight, fight mode, fight or flight mode, really. So, yeah. So we've got a lot of examples here, and I would just keep asking that you keep thinking about how else could, if you really can ride your emotional wave and step back from it, what other questions could you ask that would really lead to a richer, more compassionate dialogue rather than kind of the accusatory, where you really become interested in knowing, okay, where you really are inquiring. All right, so we've interrupted, and I want you all to remember what you said as you interrupted it, because what we're going to do now is we're going to get to repair it. And again, I want to remind us that the repair it is the piece that, that rarely happens. The repair it says that we come back later that day, the next day, and we check in. So if I interrupted, say I interrupted a colleague who said, you know, you're good for giving directions for a woman. My repair may be to come back the next day and just engage with that colleague and say, hey, you know, you want to grab a cup of coffee, or do you want to sit down, or maybe join them for lunch, or some opportunity for me to engage with them and then have a conversation, which might look something like, you know, I really appreciate you hearing me yesterday. You know, I know that you were joking, you know, if that was what they said, but for me as a woman, it's hard for me to hear that. And so, you know, whatever it's going to happen, but the idea is that we're deepening, that we're able to kind of re-engage with the person to let them know that it's actually okay that we're in disagreement. So what I'd like you to do in the final chat box that says repair it is, based on how you interrupted it, what would you say a day later if you were to go back up to that person? So you can engage. Sometimes the interrupt is just about providing more information to, you know, like a number 3 that I bet 80% of my kids will end up. That's when the data might come in handy, is to actually, you know, present data that says, hey, you know, this is really who our kids are and what they need, and then engage in a conversation that way where you're actually providing real information as opposed to beliefs, and then the engaging, of course, and then observing. Sometimes you just need to see a different environment, be around people who are in that situation or experiencing it differently, so that you can begin to grow and expand your understanding. And so how would you interrupt it? Okay, so Anjanette, I was thinking about our conversation yesterday and found an interesting article that shows that teen pregnancy is very much on the decline. So I would send you the link so you can review it. That's excellent. I mean, that's an excellent strategy, because you're letting them know, hey, it's okay, I'm not trying to rub it in your face, and I want to give you some more information that's just going to challenge and push back a little bit on that. Pamela said, can we follow up on a conversation the other day? I'd like to reflect a little bit further about our talk. Excellent. Again, all invitations. Karen's like, I'm stuck. And I get that. I get it. And because I think part of it too, I know for me, as I've been kind of evolving with this protocol for the last 15 years, is there's times where I almost feel like I just want to be mad. Like I'm stuck because I'm still angry, and I think that the responsibility should be on them. But really, the person who says it is many times in how implicit bias specifically works, if it's implicitly, especially when you're talking about people saying something like that's gay, because it's been so oversaid that it just, like, I think that's where people become indifferent, because they don't have a personal connection to it, or it just doesn't matter to them. But what we have to do is really understand that that we have to hold folks accountable for their language and its impact, and so I can't be stuck in being mad. I've got to remember that, you know, I'm an educator and my job is to educate. So how do I do that? Yeah. Okay. Based on your comment yesterday, I realized you may not have had Indian food. Would you be open to having lunch? Oh yeah, I love that, Suinder. That's awesome. Like, yeah, invite them, engage, and say, you know what, I know that was a hard time. I actually brought you some. It's my family specialty. You build relationships. You kind of, you know, push them then to think again about what they're saying and how they're saying it. Yeah, I want to follow up on our conversation from yesterday and hope that we can dialogue further about this. I have an opportunity to reflect and want to discuss it with you. Excellent, all of them. And so those are all great repairs. And what I know from practice is that if we could build this into our our daily practice of communicating with each other, that the way we interact would change drastically. It has for institutions that have been using it. We are able to hold each other more accountable for our actions, and also we're able to engage in a way that's authentic and true to us. And I really, I always say that the only reason we talk about people is because we don't talk to them. And so we need to start talking to each other. We need to push back in a way that allows us to grow. And I always assume positive intentions unless it's absolutely obvious that I can't. But I still, when I'm talking to educators, my assumption is that we're all here for the same reason. And you may be stuck. You may be stuck in your thinking. You may have had some bad experiences. So how do I support you to get unstuck? All right. Thank you so much for participating in this piece. And there's other opportunities. The cards exist where you're able to practice. You can create your own cards, which is how I got inspired. Again, from just teachers and students. But the idea is that what are you going to do to practice? And you do. I think you were emailed a copy of the protocol that actually walks you through each step again, but also a protocol worksheet, which we're going to engage with in a little bit so that you can start your practice today. Okay, thank you. So using the protocol for your call to action, and this would be an opportunity if you have that worksheet to pull it up. I know there's a picture on a further slide, but you could use it now to think about. When you use the protocol, you can use it individually. So for instance, for a personal issue, like for me, if I'm stuck on a tough decision, I know that I need to do something, or getting me to move into action, I can actually recognize what my issue is. I can decide how I'm going to interrupt it, and then the repair it is what am I doing to make sure that interruption stuck. So that's a very personal level. The interpersonal issues with other people is basically what we just practiced here. So that's disagreements with colleagues, interventions with students, family issues. The protocol works. It allows us to slow down, and it works across the table. And then finally, I'd like for us to go concurrently, not instead of, because it's always easier for us to look external than it is to look internal, but concurrently to start looking at what are some of the systemic issues that exist at your site that require your attention, and what would it be like to do that. So examples would be disproportionate discipline, curriculum review, like looking at, we have an opportunity now with the new history social studies framework to tell a story that's very different than the story that most of us were told. And so how do we do that? I have a student, I say she's a student, she's a teacher, but a student of mine who decided to create a rubric for the curriculum adoption. And the rubric is based on critical race theory. And so the questions all ask about whose voice is representative, how do people of color show up in the text. But in using this rubric, if the new books that they're looking to adopt don't align with this and score in the top 2 parts of the rubric, then they know they can't adopt it. And that's what putting the lens looks like. It changes the way we do business. It's not something, and it's not an add-on. It's the way we change. It's how we change the system. So if the way we're reviewing curriculum is through this lens, then I don't have to worry about, I got to do this too. It's just part of how we do it, right? A through G access, achievement course access, that's also a biggie. And I picked these as examples because I think that they are pretty consistent across the board when we're looking at achievement levels for our kids of color throughout California schools. So, yes, and if you do, I know Susan has written that if you have questions for me, please, put them in the chat box, and they're helping me monitor so that I can ask if, anything specifically related to what I'm sharing right now. Okay, so how do you continue to improve? You know, that we're not going to nail it the first time. And I also, you know, I remember when I first started teaching, and I was really gung-ho, and I remember some veteran teachers were like, slow down, kid. I would get on board with something, you know, we'd have to change, and they're like, you know, Nancy, you just need to wait because this too shall pass. And I remember hearing that all through my first few years, like this too shall pass. And I think that's how equity has been approached. It's like people haven't really fully engaged because it's important now, there's money behind it, and then when it's no longer on the radar, it disappears because we haven't embedded it. We haven't embedded it into the way we do things. And so when we want to continue to improve, we have this cycle of inquiry, which is actually really important for anything we're doing. But specifically, when we talk about putting this equity lens on, how do we make sure that we're constantly reflecting on our problems and our solutions and then how they show up? And so, you know, we start off with understanding what is the problem. So maybe I'm saying that it's disproportionate discipline, right? What is the current, what is happening currently compared to what we desire? So that's where we pull up our data. Our data says that we're doing this. This is what we would like. Here's our demographics. We're out of proportion here with these groups. So we know that we need to address these groups. So when you start to design and implement an intervention, it should be specifically related to the groups that are marginalized, right? You then, after you've had time to do your implementation, you go back, you collect the data, and see has your intervention actually impacted or created new behaviors and actions, and then you reflect. If it has, then you go back and you continue doing and you see if there's anything missing. If it hasn't, then you don't throw it out, you revise it. Now maybe down the road you throw it out, but I think we're too quick to get rid of something as something doesn't work, when maybe we haven't actually used the right, you know, implemented it correctly, or maybe we need to, you know, make some tweaks to make it work. So how do we begin to look at it in a larger, like, okay, we're on the right track, but what will also help us reach these goals? And so I really encourage that instead of trying to tackle everything, and I know depending on your role, it seems like you have to, but what would it look like to take one of the issues that you've identified and actually do an action research on it, to actually take it through yourself, not hand it off, but actually, you know, take it through this whole cycle of inquiry to see if what you're doing is working, and if it's not, what changes are you making, and if it's not, it goes back to our number 2 and number 3, which is whose voices are in the room, what input are you getting, are you doing this in isolation, or are you using the synergy of a group to actually make these decisions? So we're going to do an activity, and it's called Starting with Ourselves. And so my question that I'm posing is who am I? So who are you? Who are you? Who am I? Okay. So to start off, I want to define diversity, which is all the ways in which people differ. And so that's our common definition right now. What are all the ways that we differ from each other? And so, and what are the pieces that make up who I am? So we have to recognize that people affiliate with multiple identities. So for me, there's, you know, and by the way, I want to say that you're not limited to this graphic. Your identity may not be on this graphic. It was just a graphic I found that kind of gave the idea. But the importance is really in having a graphic such as this is that these puzzle pieces come together, and it's in connecting all these puzzle pieces that you actually get to know who I am in totality, right? And so I'd like to invite us to think about 5 things. I want you to think about 5 things that are part of your identity. And if you have a piece of paper, you can write them down. And if you're willing, you can type them out in the chat. What are the 5 things that make up your identity? Okay. And then I know some people are typing, so I don't want to interrupt that, and I know some people are just thinking, but what I'd like you to do is, if whether you've written them down or you have them in your head, I'd like you now to cross off 2. Cross off 2. So Maureen said experiences, gender, language, perspective, nationality. Jada, Christian, woman, mother, biracial, athlete. Yeah. All right. So since Maureen and Jada, you are the 2 that have typed it in and I can look at it, I'd like you to cross off 2. What 2 would you remove? And for those of you who are not typing in, maybe you can share, what does it feel like when I tell you that you have to? I'm not asking you to, I'm telling you to, right? I'm telling you to remove 2 of them. What feelings come up for you when I tell you to remove 2? And that's what we have to get into. So an example, yeah, David's like, this is who I am, right? And that's it. So let's talk about, though, where we ask, Lindsay says, I feel restricted. Yeah. So let's talk about what it looks like for our kids. So one of the most common ones that we ask our kids to erase when they come in is language. We say, you know what? You can't have language. I've actually just recently had to deal with a teacher posting standard English only allowed, or no, standard English only zone is what it said. So not only was a teacher knocking, just someone who comes in with a home language that's different from English, but even when that home language is not as refined yet, that there's criticism about that. So how does that feel when you walk in and a big piece of who you are and who your identity is removed? We know that religion is another one that's removed for a lot of our kids, because they walk in, and if they walk in and they're Muslim, and they walk in and they have different beliefs, we cross that off too, because we make it dangerous for them in some instances for them to actually participate, because we don't choose to understand who they are. So when we start crossing off these pieces, we really do become restricted. And so Kim, I appreciate your comment. You said, how am I supposed to choose, right? And because it makes up who you are, and you feel marginalized. Ruth said, yeah, because we are actually taking pieces of who you are away. Now you as adults, you and I can push back against that, but what happens when our little ones are coming in? And this is starting in elementary and kindergarten. What happens when they're coming in and we're taking these things away, right? So it's just something to think about. It's like, how do we honor what you are and see that is who you are in complete and total, right? And that all of this enhances your ability to get to where we need you to get to for success. So it's just a way to think about it. So we're going to take this activity a little further. And so for me, these are my top 3, right? My top 3 are race, gender, and nationality. And the reason they're my top 3 is because they're the most obvious pieces, and I am continually judged by these 3 things, right? So they're not the only aspects of my identity, but they're the top 3, because the first thing you see about me and you notice I'm Black. And we can say we don't see color. It's nonsense. We all see color. We're supposed to see it. And actually, there's nothing wrong with seeing it. Because we have attached negative stereotypes to them, we find seeing color, seeing whiteness, seeing Blackness, seeing Latinx, seeing these things as problematic. But really, if we were to take away all the negative connotations and just saw what people were, we would be doing much better. So race is my number 1. Gender, because the second thing that impacts me in my daily life is that I'm a female. And then for me, my nationality, being an American. I'm proud of being an American, but I have right now, I'm in a huge internal kind of struggle about what it means for me to be an American living in this country right now. Also what it means when I travel abroad as an American, right? So I want you to think about what your top 3 are, okay? Because we had our 5, and you came down to your top 3. Some of us didn't even want to take them away, but I get it. On the survey, the question is, was race in your top 3? So if you can just start clicking and we can see. All right. We're getting a good idea. Getting close to our number a little bit. So right now we have 61% who said that race was in their top 3, and 38% right now who say that it isn't. And we're still getting some more votes in. Great. So here's my question, and I'm just going to ask, I want to keep the poll up, but can we just slide it over to the right a little bit, or up higher? Yeah, great. So because I'd like people to keep adding in as we do it. So what's important about this is that I want us now to imagine that I'm your student, or I'm in relationship with you, and I'm letting you know that race is my number 1 because of how it impacts my life. There's a lot of beautiful things about it, but when I talk about impact, I'm talking about the negative impact, the fact that I'm constantly aware that I am Black and what that means and the decisions that I have to make based on that. So if race is in my top 3 and in fact is my number 1, but it never shows up for you in your top 3 or your top 5, how do you support me when it's something that I need to talk about and it's something that you're not thinking about, right? And this is where we come back to this notion of cultural competency. It doesn't make you a bad person. But what it means is that if I show up needing to talk about this and it's not even on your radar, how do you support me? And so how do we build relationships so that we're clear, so that you know that race is my number 1 and that I'm impacted specifically by my race. And when we talk about, Jada was asking about the difference between race, ethnicity, and nationality. So nationality just goes back to like country of origin, right? Ethnicity and is your background, your kind of culture, and your heritage, and the race is really the color of your skin. And this is why it's broken, right? Because race is a social construct that was a tool used to separate us. So it was easy to say, Black and white, and to separate us, and brown, and then after that we kind of get lost, right? We kind of can't go any further, and yet we have a whole group of people who are not included in that binary, right? And so when we come down to it, that's why why we talk about race is because a lot of those folks who don't have the skin color that looks like me, and may be lighter but may have a different ethnicity and a different nationality, may still inherit the traits of the skin color. So if you're fair, then you become white in this country. If you're dark, then you become brown and Black, and we see that. That's why, especially in California, anyone who is brown is considered, they just default to Mexican, and there's nothing wrong with Mexican except for I could be brown and be from Central America. I could be brown and be from the Caribbean. I could be brown and be from many different places. So when you just say that I'm Mexican, you actually are not. Again, you're not actually knowing who I am by identity, right? And the same thing, our Asian is another big, kind of group that we talk about under ethnicity, but it actually, within the Asian culture, there's so many variations, and they're very distinctively different. And so we've kind of created these just very large groups that actually don't do a very good job of defining who we are. And so we really have to know that, that we're never going to have an effective conversation and understanding until we understand the social construct of it, and we understand why it was created and how it's proving to be successful in doing what it was intended to do, which is to actually keep us separate without understanding how connected that we are. So I think that helps. But to bring us back then to this is really the importance of knowing that who are you serving, what is their identity, how does it show up, and how does yours connect with them? And if there's not a connection, then what do we do to make it a connection? It's really, really vital that we begin to understand how we show up and how those we serve show up, so that we can be more congruent with that. Thank you for your participation again. It's hard to, I feel like a talking head right now. So again, if you have questions, please go in there. I'm trying to keep track and do this at the same time. All right, so what can the district do? District responsibility. One of the district responsibilities is to ensure that professional learning opportunities exist throughout the year. And I really want to emphasize that it's super vital that they're incentivized. We have to, in the teaching profession, and we all know that we really feel under respected. You know, we don't get paid what we deserve to get paid. We all know that, and so that, and I don't want us to accept that we have to continue to buy things and do things on our own, because that's just what teachers do. And I get it, and I know that's a whole nother webinar probably, but I just want to put that in there because I think that we have this expectation that that teachers are staying on top of the literature and in this continual learning place, but we're really not supporting them to do that. And so if we want to see change, we have to invest in change. And if we want with our teachers and our staff to do these things, we have to incentivize them to let them know that it's important that they do it and that we value their time. I think there's too much that we expect our teachers to do without compensation. I'm currently sitting on a committee, and the first year they fed us, we ended up going into a second year, and they decided that there was no longer a budget to feed us. Now we're all volunteers, and we all show up from 4 to 8 or 9 once a month, and now there's no food. And for me, that was extremely problematic, right? And so this idea that we need to be able to create opportunities that are ongoing and let people know that we value their time and we value their interest, and that we're saying that this is important to us and we're putting our money where our mouth is. A second thing that a district is responsible to do is seek to include missing perspectives, and I've said this a couple times, but this looks like intentional hiring. If you want a diverse teaching staff, you have to hire for it. They're not going to necessarily show up on your doorsteps. You have to go looking, and you have to know where to look. So most of us don't know where to look. We need to start bringing in those missing perspectives to help us know where we can go to get folks to be part of our team. So HBCUs are great places if you're looking for, folks. There's Latino institutions. There's places you can go. You have to go where the people are. And we have to know that it's okay. And so part of this is challenging some of this notion of, and I think this is where we get into some of the conversation about whiteness and white privilege, of feeling like somehow there is, like this is my, when you intentionally hire people of color because you understand there is a need and you understand that our kids need to have people in front of them that look like them, that somehow that's taking a job away from somebody else. And so this is part of that deeper dive that districts will have to do to get to the root of that thinking that somehow this is my job and that somehow by intentionally hiring a person of color that we've taken a job away from someone it belongs to. And that's part of what we have to push against, because there are some real beliefs about that, or by intentionally hiring that somehow my job is in jeopardy. And my thing is, if you're doing a good job, I don't think your job's ever in jeopardy. And so I by no means believe that only people of color can teach students of color. In fact, I can't believe that, because then that means we're doomed, right? So if we have a 63% white teaching staff, what's important is, one, understanding that you can teach all kids, right? But that in order to be successful in doing that, that the responsibility is for each of us to understand how to teach and who our kids are. And that's even for me as a black teacher. Being a black teacher, teaching Latinos in National City did not lead to me being an expert at teaching Latinos. It led to me knowing about black culture. I had to learn about the culture of my students that I was serving, and I had to make modifications. Also, it's a responsibility to evaluate who is at the table, and we talked about this earlier. So, whose voice is missing, whose voice is there. And then finally, I think it's the district responsibility to create opportunities to build meaningful relationships between students and families. A lot of what we do in schools right now, when we invite families in, it's either a show and tell, or we invite them in to teach them how to read to their kids. But we actually miss the first step, which is the salutation. We have to build relationships with families to make them want to come in. And so are we investing time to actually build those kinds of, to build those kinds of bonds with families, which means that when they come in, are they coming in and we're actually doing team building and opportunities to get to know about them and to hear their voice and to hear their perspective, instead of constantly coming in with this deficit thinking of that I need to give you something, right? Yes, Maureen, parent engagement is required in LCAP. Use it. It is required, and it actually makes us far more effective if we can get parents involved. Okay. As I transition, I want to think about this quote. Too many of our best and brightest have been rendered virtually inaccessible to us, largely because they have experienced too much schooling and too little education. And I'd like you to think about this. There's actually a book, Too Much Schooling, Too Little Education. And this idea that, that we learn how to do school, but we're not really truly learning. And so are we really providing the best resources and the best opportunities for our kids to actually be learners and to actually be able to be empowered to make decisions and to advocate for themselves, And I always think about, I don't want to save children. I want to provide children with skills to save themselves, right? I worked in juvenile court and community schools, and so by the time they got to me, they're already expelled and or incarcerated, and everyone wanted to save them. I'm like, that's not our job. Our job is not to save them. Our job is to support them to save themselves, to be their own leaders and their own resources. And so how do we do that? Okay. Equity is not a checklist item, and I'm going to reinforce that before I move into the last one. It is not something that is just done. It is a journey, and just because you did it at the beginning of the school year, it's not over. And so if we're truly talking about an equity lens, it looks like how we do everything. Everything we look at is through this lens. We should be asking tough questions every day of the actions we're making, the decisions we're making, the policies and procedures that we're enforcing. And this is just a little reminder. I would like to bring us back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I think the most important thing for me is for us to remember that it's a hierarchy, which means that we have to do it sequentially, that you cannot go to the top of this pyramid without climbing these rungs first. And so if I want to get to self-actualization and kind of at ease, I always say this is learning. This is learning. Self-actualization is actually being able to learn and being prepared to learn and ready to learn, then all these things have to happen. So if I'm your kid and I'm showing up and maybe I have this first rung, the physiological met, but I'm not feeling safe because I'm being bullied at school or I've got some other issues going on, then I can't actually perform at my best. And if we can remember this, then we end up remembering the importance of meeting our students and meeting our staff too and our colleagues where they are on that day. And this takes us even back to the protocol, because if I meet you where you are, then I can help you, if you're open to it, to move forward, as opposed to berating you for where you are, right? And we do this with our kids. We berate them for where they are. They come in and they don't speak standard English, so we berate them instead of giving them the skills and teaching them how to speak standard English, while valuing that they're coming in with their own home language, and that home language also serves them. It's not either or, it's both. And understanding that both of those things are important, again, helps us to get them up this ladder where we can actually get them to belonging and self-esteem, because we're not trying to take something off their identity list, right? So we're going to briefly go through the levels of integration. This is James Banks for multicultural content. And as we go through these things, I want you to think about what you can do as a district, as a site, as a county office, whatever role you're in, to operate at stage 4, which is our goal. And this is, again, this is one way to put that equity lens on. So for James Banks, his level 1 is the contributions approach. And actually, this is where we all are mostly. I want overgeneralization, I got it, but we're mostly at this place where we focus on heroes, holidays. We just did Cinco de Mayo, and really it means we've contributed, we've done this, but it actually has nothing to do with actually the ethnic group or actually have anything to do with our curriculum. There's no reinforcement behind it. So it's this isolated piece pulled out of context, and we plop it down in the middle. And so you can think about, where do you do this? Where are you using level 1 approaches in your work? Susan just posted the article that you can click on that link if you're interested in it. Level 2 is the additive approach. And this is where I talk about thematic units. So you'll do a theme, something comes up, and we're like, oh, we really have to address this. So we're going to do a theme on this. So again, it's better, but it actually isn't transformative at all. You've got a theme, but it's out of context. It's something that we plopped in again, but we're doing a little more around it. There's more development, there's more support, but it's not embedded, right? It's not a piece of what we do all the time. So level 3 is where we want to get to in level 4. Level 3 is the transformation approach. And this is where we actually begin to change the structure of the curriculum. And so an example I'll use is the new social studies standards framework. The framework actually calls for us to change the way we've done it. It's asking us to ask tough questions, to bring in missing perspectives, to give the perspective of those impacted by the colonization of the U.S. and all the things that happen. And it really becomes a part of the way that we're doing, where we're learning about the issues, we're learning multiple perspectives, and we get to deepen it. And so this is, if we could get to level 3, we'd be doing really great. But level 4 is our goal. And level 4 is our goal because it actually moves us to social action. It says that we become fully aware of the context of that we're operating in. We're looking at curriculum through these things, and then we are teaching our students that they have a civic responsibility to actually, that they are a part of the system, and that they can either be a part of the problem or they can be a part of the solution, but it actually empowers them into action, and that's what we want to get to. So my invitation, if you can click on that link and check it out later, is to, 1, evaluate where you are currently in the different activities that you're doing, and then think about how can we get to level 3 and level 4, level 4 being the goal. So let's build your toolkit. We've got a few more minutes and then we'll have time for Q&A. We're going to go through a few pieces of things. You were emailed the protocol. So this is the worksheet that I walked us through when we did the did the cards, and then that little handout is an opportunity for you to actually personalize it. And so one of the things I'd ask you to do is to think of a personal situation that you know requires your attention and write it down, and then think of a professional situation that you know requires your attention and write it down. And then the next thing would be to interrupt it. What would you say or do in the personal situation and the professional situation so that you can begin to have a discourse around it? The repair it would wait until you see how to interrupt it go. So that's one of the pieces. We have supports on our website at epiceducation.com /media that actually give you their free videos how to use the protocol if you're interested. The second tool that you were emailed is an equity walkthrough tool. This has been extremely powerful for us. We use it with all the districts we work with, and we start with the physical environment. It's physical environment, relationships, relevance, rigor, and results. As you can see that when you get to the other four, it gets a little bit more subjective. And so the physical environment is a good place to start to get used to receiving feedback, to coaching, but also to get used to putting this equity lens on so that when you're looking at something, you can look at it with an objective eye. Either you have it or you don't, or it's minimal. How do we get it to, based on the rubric, to a 4, right? Then we have this video. It's listed here. My invitation is to please go and watch it. It's called Know Your Why. It's very short, but I cry when I watch it because it just reminds us to remember why we do what we do and to be clear about it. And also, I would take it so far as to say that our kids should know their why. Like, why are they in school? Why are they getting an education? And it's not because it's mandatory. It can't be because my mom said so, you know. So take a look at this video. I don't think you'll be disappointed with it. EPIC does free book studies every summer. We started with the new Jim Crow. We did the Hillbilly Elegy last year, and this year we're doing The Warmth of Other Suns and White Rage. And the one thing I want to mention is that the dates were swapped on the 2 book studies. White Rage actually ends July 29th, and The Warmth of Other Suns ends August 12th. The Warmth of Other Suns is a larger book. It also will be worth 2 professional development units, and White Rage is worth 1 because of the size difference. But the opportunity to, you know, to engage with other people, they're facilitated book studies. We're in there with you. And again, you sign up. The tiny URL just signs you up, and then we'll send you information for logging in. We've had, last year we had about 260 folks enroll, pretty powerful stuff reading these books together. And it's nice to read with other people, you know, again, with different perspectives. So you're all invited to join us, and you're also invited to pass it on to anybody that you're interested in, who you think might be interested in doing this. And so I want to kind of end on this. This is my COO, Karen, and I always tell the story of Beverly Tatum's analogy in her book, Why Are All the Black Children Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And she does this analogy saying that this moving walkway is institutionalized racism, and it pretty much runs on its own. It keeps moving. It needs a little oil now and then. It might need a new panel, a new thing, but basically it just keeps moving. And when you see people running on it, she said, those are your extremists. And so when we see the extremists for whom the system is moving too slow, that's who we call a racist. And this is where our troubles begin, because when we get called a racist, all we have in our mind is this picture of those extreme people out there, those people who are, you know, doing hate crimes and doing things. But really, if you think about this analogy, we're standing on this moving walkway, and even if we're not walking, we're still standing, which means we're still moving, right? So she says, if you want to be an anti-racist, you have to turn around. The problem is when you turn around, you're bumping into people. And you're bumping into people who are committed to keeping you facing the other way because you're making them uncomfortable. And so my invitation is, when are you ready, and are we ready to turn around and start pushing up against a system that, when we stop walking, continues to take us forward. So success is a journey, not a destination. We have to know that if we want to see change, we have to continually put an effort behind this change. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I'd like to open it up for any questions that you might have. Thank you, Jada. I hope it was useful. I know that it's a lot of information, and it's hard just to listen, but I appreciate your engagement and participating with us, and I hope that that it sparked some interest and answered some questions, or maybe even better, maybe created some new questions. Thank you all. I appreciate that. Great, I'm glad it was useful. That is the goal. Nice to see you here, Suwinder.
So we are very grateful to you, Nancy, for all of your work to prepare such a fabulous webinar to share with our constituencies. We're very glad to all of the participants who were able to join us at a very busy time of the year. There's a very quick survey that Susan will send out at the end, and we hope that you just take a couple of seconds. It's really all it will require in order for you to complete it. And there is one question here. Elizabeth asks, can you speak to the role of how students are taught, but not only what they're taught, but how they are taught?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's super critical. And, for me, it takes me back to thinking about Howard Gardner's work on multiple intelligences, and understanding that we all have modalities of preference of how we learn. And what we've found in our studies is that we tend to teach to our strength, which is we teach the way we learn. So if we learn in an auditory fashion, we will tend to teach more that way. But if you have students who are more kinesthetic, then it could be problematic. And so really having us, one, understand what kind of learner we are, which means what kind of teacher we become, and then stepping out of discomfort into trying some strategies that we may not feel proficient at, but that actually allow us to be more in alignment with who our students are and the way they learn. What we do know for sure is that kids of color typically come in much more verbal and much more kinesthetic. And so if you're not in those areas or those make you uncomfortable, what are we doing to get there? So that would be one place, just for a very quick answer of where to start. But I would start with a self-assessment always, knowing who you are and how you learn.
And we see that Julie Ann has a presentation today, and that she's added your key points to today's presentation.
Oh, great. Thanks.
Fabulous.
Yeah, that is immediate application. I'm glad it's useful.
Dr. Melody Hood, our colleague from CDE, is typing.
Yeah, and then Elizabeth, you said in terms of equity, I think it's the same thing, except for the assessment would be, one, asking yourself, what is your culture and how does that show up? And then truly understanding that each of us brings culture in there. So if I, as a Black woman, I'm bringing in culture. As a white, teacher, you're bringing in culture. I think about my culture every day, and this goes back to that thing. I think about race every day, so I'm very cognizant of what my cultural pieces are. If it's not on your list, and you don't think about it, that when I ask you about what your culture is, you may struggle to define it, right? And so if you're struggling to even define who you are, what you have to understand is it still shows up. It still shows up in the way we instruct. It still shows up in how we set up our room. It shows up in the literature we choose. I had a book club where someone said they decided they wanted to do all the classics. And at this point, I had read enough, and I was going to bow out of the group because I'm like, I'm tired of reading books where I am described solely by the N-word. And so all the classics that you want to read are in that time frame, and I'm not interested, right? And so this was a group of women, all white women, Mormon women, where I lived in my community in San Diego, and they had never, what I realized, it never dawned on them that I might have a different reaction to this literature than they did. And by my being able to share it with them, rather than leave the book club, they readjusted their thinking about the different books that they chose, actually, again, because of me putting on this racial lens to see why I might, have a problem with it. And it turned out to be one of the most powerful conversations around this that I've ever had. But that's how it speaks to equity. And that's why we have to have multiple perspectives. Because if I hadn't said anything, you've got this kind of homogenous group of white Mormon women who are good women who work hard, but who never once considered how I might be interpreting what we're reading.
Thank you. And Dr. Hood from CDE has provided a link to a bias test that comes out of Harvard's Project Implicit. And we have a question from Kate. It seems that we can teach RIR to students as well, and she's asking if you've used it with students.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, let me grab something. We teach it to students because they actually help us move quicker in our process. And one of the things that we've done, I'm just pulling out the deck so that you can see, is the cards that you engage with were the general, and they are not necessarily education focused, but we actually have an entire deck that's dedicated to teens. We have 50% of the cards are for secondary, and then 50% are for elementary, and we actually teach them a protocol because when you get to some of these other scenarios, we have adult to teen scenarios, we're actually trying to empower kids to be able to have this compassionate dialogue with adults as well and into the conversation instead of coming from this place of anger. And yeah, Jada, we actually sell these online on our website. You can buy them. There's a sampler deck that has all the different scenarios, which are adult to adult, adult to teen, teen to teen, and general. And then there's each one of those decks is its own deck as well, so you can get just a teen deck if that's what you want.
And one more question. Have you seen schools shift practices or their outcomes using that walkthrough tool?
Absolutely. I have to tell you, one of the most, Nevada Unified uses it. And when I did my first walkthrough with them, one of the things we noticed in the kinder classrooms were the new sound cards that they just put up. And there were 3 people on all the sound cards. All the rest were either animations or fruits or vegetables or animals. And the 3 people were a white doctor who was male, a white nurse who was female, and a white firefighter who was male. So not only was it racially insensitive, it was also gender stereotypical, right? And no one noticed it, and I pointed it out, and everyone kind of stepped back at that wow thing. But what happened immediately was people started downloading new images and changed all the images on their sound card so that was more representative. And so the thing about using the physical environment, especially to start off with, is that those are fixes that you can do immediately. And so now what we're starting to see, and what they use them with journey partners, so they pair up, and we ask that they do it 3 times a year, is that you're actually starting to see more collaboration, and you're starting to see more shifts in the physical space, taking into account really who their students are, which means that every year, because your students are changing, we should be changing too. So yeah, it's been super, super impactful.
Thank you so much. Dr. Dome has let us know that she's willing to stay to answer a few more questions, but we will go ahead and conclude our webinar at this time in respect for all of your busy schedules. And thank you again for joining us. And once more, please try to complete that quick survey. So, Dr. Dome, do you incorporate the walkthrough tool and the cards for students? And if so, what do you see as the outcomes?
We do. The student piece has been slow to come on, not because of my unwillingness for it, but I think it's sometimes hard for teachers and school personnel to receive feedback from kids. And so how do we begin to empower young people to have a voice in the environment? But where the students are being used, it's about empowerment. They feel like, oh, I have a voice and that you care about what I think about it. And the cards are powerful just because it gives them, they don't always have developmentally the maturity to engage in appropriate dialogue when their feelings are in the way, And so by practicing the protocol, we're actually supporting them to be more effective communicators, which will ultimately and hopefully lead to them being able to engage in difficult conversations without negative repercussions because they're not using the correct language, right? That gets them in trouble. So we do with the kids, again, they're feeling more empowered. One of our districts actually, and it's our first one to do it, has created an equity team of 100 people, of which 60 are students and 40 are teachers. And they're engaging and using the dialogue online through our online community and also face-to-face. And the changes in 1 year have been pretty substantial to how they've done business. And they've actually integrated the Banks model. One of the high schools did a cultural fair, and this year, and the families are in charge of setting up the booth. And it's always very exciting, and it's always about food, and it's operating completely at level 1. And what they did was they actually taught the people who bought booths, the families, the parents, about level 4 and level 3 and what they needed to do to make their booth operate at a level 3 and 4 where they could actually give more information and experience the culture instead of just looking at food and music. And the parents were more engaged, the students were more engaged, and they said that it was the best event that they've ever given. So, when you empower kids, change happens faster because they're ready for change. They're willing to change. They're used to change. It's us older folks who struggle, with change. So I definitely think that getting kids involved is the way to go. We really try to encourage all of our work we do with districts to, at some point, begin to involve the students.
Getting a lot of kudos. And again, from our team, we're so glad for the practical information for those who are participating, how to go ahead and use this information tomorrow or today.
Yeah, exactly.
And one last question, have families or caregivers participated in using the walkthrough tool?
Yeah, we actually had 2 schools when we were piloting it, again in the Novato area, who, when we did the pilot for the walkthrough, actually invited parents, PTA, ELAC, and so it was a whole community. It was probably about 15 of us walking through the room, but this principal did such an excellent job. He says they're used to us coming in, they're used to people coming in, we're going to do it. And the parents' perspective, and I'll not forget, we all walked out, and it was an incredible classroom, and this is why the perspectives need it, right? But I felt like I was represented. I felt good about it. but this one parent who comes from a different background than the rest of us in there was like, well, aesthetically, it's a beautiful classroom, but honestly, I didn't see myself whatsoever in there. And everyone kind of looked back, and she shared, and it was just this really magical moment of being able to hear someone share something and realize that it reinforced why we want that multiple perspective, right? Because we have to get parent voice. We have to get people in there because each of us brings something differently. So it definitely works. It's all about structure. The one thing I will say about the tool, though, is don't mandate it in a way where you get people. We're trying to build capacity, and we want people to be on board. And so when you do this tool, when we do the walkthrough, when we're done, one, it's voluntary for the people who do it, who volunteer to have us practice with them. And then two, after we debrief immediately so that they know, because when I hand them my paper, my notes may not be as clear as my words are. And so we want to make sure that we're very clear on the feedback we're given, and then nothing stays in our possession. So all those the walkthrough tools are handed back to that teacher or whatever that space is in, and they use it for their own coaching purposes. And then the next step of that is that they then look at all the feedback. They take what works, they throw out what doesn't, and then they decide on one thing that they want to work on. It's not about looking at the list and feeling like I'm deficient. It's about where can I start, and maybe it's about getting diverse literature in the classroom, and I can start there. I can put an order to my principal. I can get the books because I know I need them, and it's bringing to attention. So you begin to use that as a checklist. And then the reason we do it 3 times a year is so that you're holding yourself accountable for being in the cycle of inquiry and being able to, to make changes, but to know that they have to be gradual. It's not about being overwhelmed.
So thank you to all of you who stayed a little bit late, and again, thank you to Dr. Dome, and we will see you again soon. Thank you.